Okay, so here we are back, and I hope this is continuing. We seem to have good stream health. So, I'm reading today from The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation by Edward F. Edinger, and we're talking about the psychological development of any living being, whether it's an individual, a couple, or any organization. And Vincent, it's nice to see you here. That previous picture and this next one gave me the idea to suggest to you that perhaps you should do a painting of a cloud. It might be interesting if you did that. I'd love to see your version of it. Anyway, moving on here. The show that never ends. Well, I can't promise that, but I'm hopeful it'll last a while. Anyway, so picture 8. Gideon's dew drips from the cloud. Now the homunculus has disappeared into the cloud, which is still present, and the dead united body remains on the slab. The new feature is the dew drips down from the cloud. In the previous picture, a movement from below upward was taking place, from the body to the cloud, but now, with the descent of the dew, a movement is initiated in the reverse direction, from above downward. This is a very important image with deep psychological implications. The text that accompanies picture 8 calls this Gideon's dew, and we must talk a bit about that. Every now and then it happens that a dream says something absolutely explicit. I'm referring to dreams that mention very specific mythological motifs. Those are especially important because they are telling the dreamer unambiguously, look, this is the myth you're living out. Well, these alchemical texts are the same as dream documents, and here we have one that's doing the same thing. It doesn't just say dew dripped from the cloud, it says Gideon's dew dripped from the cloud. So that will be telling the alchemist who's performing this experiment, quote, you're living out the myth of Gideon, unquote. Let's go to that myth and see what that would be. We find it in the 6th chapter of Judges. At this time in history, Israel was occupied by a foreign power, the Midianites, and the Midianites had imposed their religion and were sacrificing to their gods ostentatiously to demonstrate their occupying status. In that situation, Yahweh visited a young man called Gideon. Here's what he says, quote, take your father's fattened calf and pull down the altar to Baal, the altar of the alien god set up by the occupying armies, belonging to your father, and cut down the sacred post at the side of it. Let me read it without the parenthetical, that might be easier. Take your father's fattened calf and pull down the altar to Baal belonging to your father, and cut down the sacred post at the side of it. Then build a carefully constructed altar to Yahweh. Then take the fattened calf and burn it as a holocaust to Yahweh. Unquote. That's from Judges 6:25 of the Jerusalem Bible. Gideon proceeded to do what he was told. I won't go into all of this. It's a little lengthy to get to the main part. And there's a footnote. See Edinger, the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament, pages 69 and following. Anyway, that was a pretty dangerous thing to do, and Gideon was almost caught for it. But that wasn't all. He got away with that, but then the Spirit of Yahweh came to him again and told Gideon to gather an army and start an insurrection. That's what he told him to do. And Gideon was very reluctant to do that, for it was exceedingly dangerous. So he remonstrated a bit with God, as one could do in those old times. Gideon says, quote, "If you really mean to deliver Israel by my hand, as you have declared, see now, I spread out a fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and on all of the ground, and all of the ground is left dry, then I shall know that you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have declared." Unquote. Judges 6, 36-38. With this story in mind, Jung says that the picture of Gideon's dew is a sign of divine intervention. It is the moisture that heralds the return of the soul. Question: would Gideon's dew be fate? Yes, it would. That's right. It's synchronicity. Question: how does rain differ from dew? Answer: I think in dreams they can be quite similar sometimes. They're both descending, but dew has a more mysterious quality. Dew comes down, but its appearance is miraculous. We wonder, where did that come from? And I think that's what particularly affects the unconscious and gives dew its miraculous quality. Rain is so obvious that it doesn't have that same nuance, although it's also heavenly moisture. Comment: dew is kind of like an epiphany. It appears like poetry. I came across an example of this imagery concerning dew as I was doing my work on Melville's Moby Dick. That, in many respects, is a terrible book when you consider it psychologically, and it gives one real concern for its author. It really disturbed me to think that a person actually went through this experience, and it was with a great sense of relief that I came to certain materials that showed up at the end of Melville's life, indicated that he had indeed integrated that devastating experience. One piece of evidence was a poem. Here is the final stanza. Quote, "Healed of my heart, I laud the inhuman sea. Yea, bless the angels for that there convene. For healed I am even by their pitiless breath, distilled in wholesome dew, named Rosarium." Rosarium means literally sea dew. So you see, the image of healing for Melville was one of dew. This shows what can follow the death and despair and hopelessness represented by pictures 6 and 7. Just to encourage you to do something I often do myself, let's take this image of dew and see what Jung might say about it in the Compendium of Imagery, Mysterium Coniunctionis. When we do that, we find, among other things, the following. Quote, "In ancient tradition, Luna is the giver of moisture and ruler of the water sign, Cancer. Meyer says that the umbra solis, the shadow of the sun, cannot be destroyed unless the sun enters the sign of Cancer, but the Cancer is the house of Luna, and Luna is the ruler of the moistures, juice, sap, etc. Rahner, in his Mysterium Lunae, shows the extensive use which the Church Fathers made of the allegory of the moon dew in explaining the effects of grace. Here again, the patristic symbolism exerted a very strong influence on the alchemical allegories. Luna secretes the dew or sap of life. This Luna is the sap of the water of life, which is hidden in Mercurius. There was a principle in the moon, which Christianos called the ichor of the philosopher, the relation of the moon to the soul, much stressed in antiquity, also occurs in alchemy. Usually it is said that from the moon comes the dew, but the moon is also the aqua mirifica, the wonderful water, that extracts the souls from the bodies or gives the bodies life and soul. Together with Mercurius, Luna sprinkles the dismembered dragon with her moisture and brings him to life again, makes him live, walk, and run about. As the water of ablution, the dew falls from heaven, purifies about the albedo, the white state of innocence, which, like the moon and a bride, awaits the bridegroom, unquote. That's from Mysterium Coniunctionis, Collected Works 14, paragraph 155. So you see that's directly relevant to what we're talking about. The dew descends and purifies and revivifies the dead body. The alchemical term for this phase of the process is mundificatio, purification. You remember that the soul has been separated from the body, and now, in its separated state, the body undergoes the process of purification. I would also remind you that we should think of the body symbolically as representing a psychological entity, not the concrete, literal body. It refers rather to the ego. The ego is the body of the psyche, you might say. And so what's taking place now is a purification of that dead ego by the dew, the divine dew that's falling on it. It refers to the fact that the ego is to be purified from contamination with the unconscious. I want to read you a passage where Jung refers to that. Quote, "The process of differentiating the ego from the unconscious, then, has its equivalent in the mundificatio." That's what we're talking about, the purification. And just as this is the necessary condition for the return of the soul to the body, so the body is necessary if the unconscious is not to have a destructive effects on the ego consciousness. For it is the body that gives bounds to the personality. The unconscious can be integrated only if the body holds its ground. I'm sorry, it's not the body. Let me read that sentence again. The unconscious can be integrated only if the ego holds its ground. Consequently, the alchemist's endeavor to unite the corpus mundum, the purified body, with the soul is also the endeavor of the psychologist once he has succeeded in freeing the ego consciousness from contamination with the unconscious. It comes about through the separation of the ordinary ego personality from all inflationary admixtures of unconscious material. This task entails the most painstaking self-examination and self-education, which can, however, be passed on to others by one who has acquired the discipline himself. It is no light work. It needs the tenacity and patience of the alchemist, who must purify the body from all superfluities in the fiercest heat of the furnace." Unquote. Another aspect of the purification of the ego is that not only must it be purified from contamination by the unconscious, it must also be separated and purified from contamination with the eternal man. Jung refers to that in a previous paragraph. Quote, "The rational man, in order to live in this world, has to make a distinction between himself and what he might call the eternal man. Although he is a unique individual, he also stands for man as a species, and thus he has a share in all the movements of the collective unconscious. The eternal truths become dangerously disturbing factors when they suppress the unique ego of the individual and live at his expense, unquote. And that comes from psychology of the, it comes from the psychology of the transference from the practice of psychotherapy, collected work 16, paragraphs 502 and 503. And I give you these footnotes because you have available to you in the collected works in our Dropbox these volumes. What Jung is saying is that the purification process must dissolve. What Jung is saying is that the purification process must dissolve ego self-identity so that the ego does not remain contaminated with the eternal man. He's related to the eternal man but not identified with him. This is an exceedingly important distinction. Question: there seems to be a general attempt not to extrovert the process, yet so much of it does seem to occur in an extroverted fashion. Is there any way to increase the symbolic dimension? Answer: well, you see, everything occurs on the exterior at first. The psyche is all found on the outside. That's where the alchemists found it, and tribal societies even more so. It's all outside initially, because the outside and the unconscious are effectively the same thing. Whatever is unconscious is exteriorized, or at least available for exteriorization via projection. So we're constantly going through the world gathering up fragments of our own exteriorized psyche, taking back projections, and we discover where they are by our reactions, either positive or negative. Whenever we come across something that evokes a response, that means a piece of our own psyche is out there. So we go wandering around with our bags collecting these things. At least that's how I think of it. Question: what exactly is the eternal man? Answer: the self. You see, I'm defining the unknown by the unknown. Question: is that God? Answer: well, that's one possible term for it, too. And so that is the end of picture number 8. And I would say that in terms of the PTSD discussion that we were having a little bit earlier, someone who is in a terrible battle and faces hell on earth, literally, including broken bodies and all sorts of things, does have a problem with the ego. The ego gets crushed because you don't think of yourself as being able to control that situation in any way. And so it is that ego that needs to be built up. And as we've said many times on these videos, the ego is built up through what's called the Job archetype, which is a contest, a defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. And so a contest can be a battle. A defeat can be both a victory or a loss, because the defeat may be, even if your unit or your country is victorious, the defeat can be seeing yourself as an evil person or a devil for doing the things that one has to do in combat. And so that can be a defeat whether you win or lose. And then one has to lament about that. And for the lucky ones, they come back and they are reborn into another style of life. In my case, I came back from Vietnam and was able to go to law school, which was very fortunate for me at the time. And so I was able to be reborn at that time. And I've been reborn many times since then. I'm currently in the process of being reborn again, maybe more than once. And but each time you're reborn, your ego becomes stronger. And when it does become stronger, then you're better able to handle the slings and arrows of life that happen throughout life. And so in terms of Gideon's due, he's talking about numinosum here, which is that, if you're, Winston Churchill said, if you're going through hell, keep going. But if you're going through hell, if something numinous happens to you, that helps you keep going, and it helps you be reborn. And so I've had several experiences in the chapel of the U.S. Naval Academy. Not during services, I might add, but I've fought, and I'll be discussing this in a group meeting probably sometime in February, not just yet, but I'm still working on it. But this was actually finalized yesterday, so as of yesterday I could no longer appeal, but I fought foreclosure on my home for over 8 years, single-handedly. And I put more than $1.5 million dollars worth of my own legal time into that fight. And ultimately I lost, but I've known I was going to lose for the last 3.5 years. And but the reason I did it was that I felt that I had realized something terribly dastardly, which had happened from the American financial industry, and that is that they had managed to get themselves paid double on all defaulted mortgages. And so while they were held all right by the TARP that was passed on a week's notice during the George W. Bush administration, so the financial industry was saved, but they went ahead and harvested the life savings of many of my generation, the whole baby boom generation. And so when it was happening to me, I decided to fight it, and what I learned is that my guaranteed rights as an American citizen were being denied to me by the Maryland judiciary. And that's a long, complicated story, which I'm not going to get into right now. But I was fighting for those rights, and during one of the phases, there were many losses. There were a couple of wins, but mostly losses during this eight-year period. And after one of the losses that I had to face and undergo, I was quite depressed, and I went into the Naval Academy Chapel one morning, and I sat there, and I had in my mind that the rights that I felt had been denied me were rights for which several of my brother Marines had given their lives. And so during my meditation, I had put my head down in my hands, and I had a vision of the 5 men who I knew who were killed in Vietnam, who came and each one of them put his hand on my head. And that was obviously quite a numinous experience, but it was definitely an act of grace, and something like what we would discuss in Gideon's due. And so as a result of that, I was able to be reborn and recover from that particular disappointment and continue on with the fight. Now, somewhere around that time, I knew that no matter what I did, the Maryland courts were not going to allow me to have a trial on the merits, because if they did, it would expose the frauds that the banking industry had foisted on the American people. And so, because I knew that that would be their position, I knew that I couldn't win, but I kept fighting anyway because I wanted to get the entire truth on the record. And so that's what I've done. And so now, as of yesterday, I have stopped fighting, even though I could, because I decided to fight in another court, and that's the court of public opinion. And so that's why I'm mentioning it now, because I believe that the financial industry was paid double on all defaulted mortgages, and meanwhile they harvested the life savings of a very large percentage of the baby boom generation, not to mention a lot of other people. 10 million families lost their homes to foreclosure because of the crash in 2008. And so that is something that the American people need to understand, because it has an impact on how they perceive our political world and how they vote politically. So that's why I will be doing it. But anyway, that was one of the 2 numinous experiences that I had in the Naval Academy Chapel. And I've talked about the other one on a different occasion, but as you can see by my emotion being expressed here, it was quite a numinous experience and quite meaningful to me. And I believe it was an example of this picture 8, which is God's great grace being given to me, because the spirit of those 5 men came by and told me I was doing the right thing. Now, I do know that those were psychogenic experiences, and I knew it at the time, but nonetheless, it was in those moments when it was happening, I wasn't thinking about that. It was just a numinous experience. But in the long run, that's what gave me the grace and the courage to go on with what I was doing. So anyway, that was that. Let me see if I see any comments here that I can respond to. Okay. And Buzz says the Arundel Castle Chapel is a tomb, and the statues of the two corpse-like people was very moving. The guide told us what it represents. Sorry, my blood sugar is odd, so I need to rest. Apologies for leaving so soon. Best wishes. And Monica says that state of innocence. Yeah. Martin says, I think high empaths have this problem as they almost become porous due to poor ego boundaries. Okay. Grenade says, yeah, I'm not an empath at all. My friend the other day brought up some very personal stuff about growing up with his mom, and it made me uncomfortable. I just wanted to change the subject. I would make a horrible counselor. Okay. That's probably a wise decision. It always occurred to me, Grenade, that if you're a psychotherapist, you're always dealing with other people's hardships, and if you're a Jungian analyst, you're not only getting very deep into your patient's unconscious, but you're also getting very deep into your own unconscious, and that can be very painful, as Dr. Edinger and others have pointed out. So I know in my case, I was an attorney, and I found myself dealing with other people's hardships all the time, and it was literally wounding to me. I didn't like it. I couldn't take it, and so after practicing law for 5 years, I gave it up and went into business, and I'm certainly glad I did. And although I've been forced to run my own private personal law firm for the last 10 years, I never have enjoyed it. I did it and filed more than 4,000 pages in the local trial court. But I didn't enjoy it, even because I was dealing with my own difficulties, my own financial difficulties. And so if you are sensitive to such things, I recommend you find a different career where you can be very happy. And well, I'll just leave it at that for now. So anyway, thank you for joining me today. That was picture number 8 from the Rosarium pictures, and I was reading from The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation by Edward F. Edinger and published by Inner City Books. I urge you to get your own copy, because this is sort of a summary of the individuation process, not only of individuals, but also of couples, because couples, when you marry someone, you begin to share a psyche. Each one of us is only half of wholeness, and when you marry, you have the chance for complete psychic completeness. And, so reminds me of this advertisement where you see the beautifully dressed young woman, and she's out on a date, a first date with this young man who has a very gray t-shirt that doesn't quite fit anymore, and it's all stretched out, and obviously it's an over-the-top image, but it's obvious that this young man hasn't respected her. And the point is that, I mean, from a psychological point of view, and for young men out there who are thinking about dating, from a psychological point of view, you have to understand that when you're dating a young woman, she is a candidate to be the other half of your psyche for the rest of your life. And she's a candidate to be the mother of your children. And so it seems to me incredibly disrespectful not to dress properly when you're dating that person, except in occasions when that would be appropriate, but certainly a first date is not one of those. And from a woman's point of view, women can be pretty selective about their mates. And, if I were a woman and a man showed up dressed like that, he would be ruled out of the gene pool immediately. At least ruled out of my gene pool. And so, I think that advertisement, I don't even remember what's being advertised, funnily enough, but it does reflect something about where our society has gone, because years ago, you certainly would dress for a date, and nowadays we've gotten to the point where people will go to a date and they'll look like a slob. And is that, if that's the candidate to be your other half and to be the mother of your children, if she'll accept that behavior, is she good enough for you? And if she'll accept that behavior, is she being foolish and selecting that man as her mate? Those are big questions. And so you might want to reflect on those going forward. Okay, so tomorrow I will do my best to do picture 9 at least, and possibly both 9 and 10. And Grenade says, some girls are into it and I can't explain why. If they're into it, they're accepting that kind of behavior. And so you have to ask yourself, is that woman going to be a good mother? And is she good enough for you to represent your other side? Because in a marriage, what I was talking about, a rebus is the container that develops between a man and a woman in marriage psychologically. And Billy Joel had a song about this when Christy Brinkley was leaving him, and he said, you're the only one who knows. And so when you're a couple with someone, you share things that only the two of you can ever know. And sometimes those things are shared unconsciously. So it's an incredibly intimate relationship, regardless of the sexuality involved. And so, from a man's point of view, if the woman you're with would accept that kind of behavior, the kind of behavior that's shown in that particular advertisement, is she really good enough for you? And from a woman's point of view, if a man showed up for a first date dressed like that, I'd get up and walk out of the place. I wouldn't waste my time. But I mean, I'm just speaking from my point of view, but I just, even the depiction of that particular advertisement, I find is truly shocking. And so I think in the United States, where we've gotten into the t-shirt culture, I think we have to rethink ourselves, because the slovenly culture that we've developed isn't probably good for society at large. That is true regardless of what ethnic or national background you might come from. And I think that might be a useful test, which is if you're going out the door, look at yourself and ask, would I want to be with me if I was going out today on a first date? And and meeting with a perfectly lovely person, whether it's a man or a woman, who is properly dressed. Those are questions that we all need to ask ourselves. Just for the record, I'm going out to dinner this evening in this shirt, and it does have a collar, and it used to be that at our local yacht club, it used to be mandatory to wear a coat and tie on Saturday evenings, but it's no longer mandatory. Now we have to wear a shirt with a collar, and only in the Commodore's room do we have to wear a coat and tie. So we have downgraded our demands even in the rules of our local yacht club. I think we ought to rethink that. But nonetheless, I'm going to go with the flow of being an American male in the early 21st century and wear just a shirt this evening. And Martin says, take a copy of the MBTI personality test also with you on your date. Yep, that's very useful. If you're if you're well versed on the MBTI, then it's going to help you quite a lot. I have a very quick rule of thumb for how to figure people out on the MBTI. If you know what the scales are, there's 4 scales, and they represent ultimately 16 different possible personality types. And in a marriage, you want 2 or 3 of those personality types to be the same. If they're all the same, then you're going to have a very boring life. And if they're all different, you're going to have conflict all the time. And so you need a little bit of a jab every so often, one way or another, to have an interesting life. But I'll give you my quick and easy way of remembering the MBTI. The first scale is extroversion or introversion. If you're an extrovert, it means that you like to go to a party and yuck it up with all your friends out in the middle of the room. If you're an introvert, you like to go to a party and be off in the corner with 1 or 2 close friends chatting quietly. So that would be introversion. And then the next scale is sensing or intuitive. a sensing person, you have to show 1,000 trees and they won't believe there's a forest. An intuitive person, you can show them 3 trees and they assume there's a forest. And so you can figure out where you should be on that scale. The thinking and feeling, that's the classic difference between head and heart, between logic and emotion. And it happens that men and women nowadays come down about 50-50 on both sides on that scale. And so it used to be that men were more often the thinking one, but that's not always the case. And then the final scale is judging and perceiving. So judging people go to the grocery store with a list, and they go up and down the rows in the grocery store picking things off of a list. A perceiving person goes to the grocery store without a list, goes up and down the rows and takes food off the shelves, and they do it more intuitively, let's say, or they let something else drive them, like how hungry they are or something like that. And both types eat. And so if you don't know anything about the MBTI, I urge you to look it up online. It's called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And you can find a number of free tests that you can take to determine where you fit in that scale. And then as you're trying to pick a mate, make sure that you're not all the same or all different on those 4 scales. And because if you're all different, you're going to be fighting all the time, and if you're all the same, it's going to be a very boring life. So find 2 or 3 things that are different. And in my case with my current wife, I'm INTP and she's INTJ, and so we know this test very thoroughly, the 2 of us, because we've studied it for over 30 years. And so whenever we have a conflict, it's very often on the JP scale, and we're able to control our way of dealing with one another, because we can make a joke about, oh, that's very J of you, or oh, that's very P of you. And so we can make it into a kind of a joke between us, and it works very well. But anyway, that's a good point, Martin, that you made, and I highly recommend that strategy. And Grad says, asking myself if I would date me, that's a tough one. Yeah, well, I think all of us, man or woman, should ask ourselves, take a look in the mirror and ask yourself if you would date yourself if you were your counterpart. And that's a very good question, because it does force introspection. And introspection is a good thing to have a happy life, in my view. And so, anyway, I'll be back probably tomorrow with picture number 9 at least, and maybe picture number 10 as well. So thank you for joining me today. I'm going to sign off now, and see you tomorrow.